and thank you very much for attending the 14th Margaret Horn debate, the first virtual one, and so slightly different to what's normally occurs, where we're in some nice building with a glass of wine. But the essence of the debate is the same. It is all about considering alternatives, considering other ways of doing things, and kind of unsettling some of the usual thinking. So my name is June O'Sullivan, and I will chair this meeting tonight. We have with me three really great guests, Claire Dove, Neil Leitch, and Danny Kruger, and they will themselves introduce their their experience and their interest in this. Ultimately, the debate question is really about in times of upheaval, we have opportunities for revolution. And so really, is this the moment to really reshift our thinking on early years? So that is ultimately what we hope to do. As an audience, there's no point having a debate without you actually contributing. But because of Zoom being Zoom, one is we're recording and two, you're all muted. So we will use the chat box and keep collecting questions and comments, and then we'll keep reflecting them back. And we'll do that for the entirety, and I'll give you a sort of time check as we go along. So I'm going to start the day, and I'm going to start it in the kind of as fair as I can. So there's two men and one woman on the panel. So we'll start with a man, then we'll have a woman, and then we'll have a man. Although I have to say, the woman that you're getting would take on quite a lot of the panel without too much difficulty at all with our Claire. So Neil, do you want to kick off and introduce yourself and just make a comment about your interest in this and the view, your sort of the beginning of the view of what the debate subject is?
Okay, so I'm Neil Leitch. I'm the Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, which is a membership organisation. So we represent about 14,000 members, large groups, small groups, childminders, you name it. Basically, we will represent them. We're also an operator in our own right, so I'd like to think that we have a bit of an insight in terms of the challenges. The difference between us and many providers, I guess, of the scale we're at, so we operate 64 settings, is that we operate wholly and exclusively in areas of deprivation. So we witness firsthand those challenges. The interest for me, I guess, is, and my background, I should say right at the outset, is that I'm not sort of steeped in early education, child development. My background was finance. I used to chair the Finance Industry Standards Association and somehow fell into the role by volunteering. But I will say this, in terms of social impact and social, I guess, relevance, is that I came from a single parent family, a fairly abusive father, ended up in a care home, left school, came out when I was about 12, left school, I was 14. And so I'd like to think that I could put something back at this particular point in time. Referring to the question, June, why I think it's of interest to me is because what we have at the moment, I guess it fails providers. If you talk to parents, many will say it fails them. And then when you look at the areas of disadvantage, I would suggest that we're on the cusp of failing many children, particularly located in those areas. That's me.
Thank you, Neil. That sets the scene nicely. Claire.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here with my old mate, June. So why am I interested in this particular subject? For the last 38 years, I ran an organization. It was a women's organization training women in non-traditional industries. And when we looked at, we didn't put a course on. We looked at the needs of women and built it around their needs so they could fully participate. And this was in the early 80s when it was still thought that women should be at home looking after their kids and not recognizing that for many households, they may be lone parents, they needed that income, or it might be, a joint household and they still needed that extra money in their in their houses. And so I worked to ensure that women had childcare. And everyone thought of childcare just for, babies up to toddlers, and then they went to school. But one of the biggest barriers were when you were working was what happened to your child at the end of the school day if you still had to work. What was the provision? What were the needs? And we used to pay for all the nursery care for all our students, but we also paid for them to go into a contract for somebody to pick up their children from school so they could fully participate. And people wondered why we got some brilliant results in education from our women. It's because we're taking care of the needs. And, you know, then we went on, we got our own building, we had our own nursery in there. But what alarmed me as I was coming to the end of my tenure, and I retired from my role at Blackburn House this summer, was the neediness of children now. I was seeing poverty coming in. We were bringing children in early so they had a good meal, you know, with the hours that they were given. We were making sure we were given clothes. So we turned out into a social, you know, welfare type of situation, which is not what we were there for. We were there to have a stimulating, now we still had a stimulating, wonderful nursery, but you saw what was going on outside of this. And also what really worries me is that, you know, I sit on a number of economic panels, et cetera, and we talk about all kinds of skills training. We never talk about the child. You know, and where they are in that in this discussion. And that's why I loved when in the notes I got from June, it said, what is our view of the child? What is the importance to us as a society that we embrace our children and that we ensure that they have the right start? And that for me was important also in Blackburn House, is that we gave children that start in life that they deserved, you know, despite what their background was, etc. So I'll stop there, June. That's where I'm up to on the debate.
Okay, thank you. Danny.
Thank you. Thanks, June, and good to be with you all. I just to introduce myself, I'm the Conservative MP for Devizes in Wiltshire, and I was elected last year, so been there since last December. Before that, I did bits and bobs around in politics, but most of my career was, I did about 10 years running a charity that I founded with my wife, working in prisons and with ex-offenders. And then what we realised is, you know, shouldn't have needed to learn this because it's sort of obvious, that mostly working with men, the primary challenge that they faced in their lives wasn't the presenting issues around unemployment or homelessness or even addiction or any of these other, you know, terrible contributors to offending behaviour, but a relational deficit that they struggle to maintain and build positive relationships with peers, with family, and with professionals and with wider society, and that was overwhelmingly because of the challenges they'd had growing up, and the obligation we felt was to try and invest in relationships as much as in the practical support which we give through the charity, and that led me more back into the sort of developed childhood work and early years, and or the preventative agenda basically. So I started working with teenagers as well, and then subsequently started a new project called the West London Zone for Children and Young People, and that is designed explicitly around the proposition that there is a lot of provision for children and families, but it's extremely fragmented, very badly targeted, and often acts too late. So West London Zone seeks to identify children at risk before their challenges become too acute, and then it works with the local, with schools, with local authorities, and with civil society to put in place a sort of bespoke package of support for those children and their families. And it does work in the very early years as well, in children's centres and nurseries. So that's sort of in a sense my background in this space. I've recently, since this year, was asked to produce a report for number 10 on how to sustain the neighbourliness and the spirit of community, and also the flexibility in the public sector, which we've seen during this crisis. And I've been, the topic for today suggests, very inspired and energized by the potential for change because of what we're going through, and how to build on the positives that we're seeing. So my report calls for calls for lots of things, but particularly a reorientation of the way power is managed in our communities. And I think, and this isn't my idea, I took all my ideas from other people, this idea, which came from a bunch of sources, perhaps the New Local Government Network more than others, around the idea of a Community Power Act, which would be an act of Parliament that puts an obligation on public agencies to give power away and to allow other agencies representing community groups or the non-profit sector to have a say in the design and delivery of public services. And I think we need to get away from the dominant paradigm that either the state, big government does work, or it contracts out to big business to do it for it. And we need to completely focus our attention on this very old and very powerful and actually very big sector that's just for interesting reasons below the radar of political and public debates, which is the community sector. And I'll stop in a second, but just to pick up on our conversation about early years, I write about it in the report, largely inspired by June, that we have a problem, which is a model of underfunded public sector provision with private equity and private children's nurseries and childcare provision, which markets itself at the self-funding, and we have a problem. And I think we need a much bigger focus on independent social sector, social enterprise in this space. The same at the other end with elder care. It's exactly the same structural problems in the economy, as it were. And I think we need to focus on this kind of model. But let's unpack in the conversation. Back to you, June.
Thank you. I think you've obviously set the cat and the pigeons going, because lots and lots of questions are coming in, as you can see. And I think there's a sort of deep felt view from the audience that we need to explore more, is that actually, can we change what it is? How do we change what it is? Because in a way, the sector has responded to the two policies that were really pushed through in the 1990s. One was to support parents to work as the answer to poverty. And secondly, it was that children really benefit from good quality early years. And so particularly those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and therefore, these are good reasons to develop the sector. But no structure was put around the sector. And then we got the Children's Centre agenda, which was very universal in its thinking and very supportive, but in a way it wasn't enough. It wasn't radical enough. It wasn't enough to really change the notion of childcare's infrastructure meaningfully. And so we've struggled all the way through with the two kind of sometimes competing, sometimes interconnected policies. One is, how do you drive good quality early education, and how many, and then how do you weave it so that also children from the different families get access? And what we seem to have right now is a split sector. There is a split within the sector, and there's a split right down deep that we need to look at. The split is, is it care as education, which you think we'd have solved by now, but we haven't. It's about the statutory versus the non-statutory sector. It's about the sort of competitiveness. So children from more well-to-do families more guaranteed really good, not necessarily the greatest childcare, but they can guarantee it. And children from the poor are at the mercy of it. In COVID, it highlighted where it was placed so that there wasn't necessarily a network where people needed. So the notion of infrastructure became quite powerful. And then there's the question that keeps coming up today is, how many reports do you need to know? And how many reports do you need to have to tell us what we know constantly? And so a lot of people step into the sector very interested, like yourself, Danny, recognizing immediately the impact of early years and early prevention, in whether it's economic through the sort of work of James Heckman or just by observing. But the first thing people do is just another report, sometimes drilling down into the details. So I'm really interested in your thinking about, how can we just throw it all up in the air and start again? Because that is possible. And do we need any more reports to tell us? And if we do, how do we start what I would call a national conversation to get people to understand the power of early years and the impact of early years, in that rather cliched term now that it takes a village to raise a child, but actually there's a great deal of truth in that. So I'm really interested in you exploring those elements, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on that, Neil, particularly to start with, just to get us going, because I think we probably have some alignment in our views on this.
I guess the slight fear I would have in, obviously utopia is that, and I'm sure when I speak to most people and you ask them, would you carry on with the existing model? Most people would tear it up, wouldn't they? And they would start from scratch. But of course, we have to live in this real world. And my slight concern with just one element of what Danny says, and I agree with Danny in just about everything, but to shift it out into, if you like, the voluntary sector or social enterprise, etc., full stop, just slightly concerns me that really is about underinvestment. And by that, I mean, whenever I give her an interview on LBC, Nick Ferrari is a good example. He always asks the same question. Why should people that don't have children be paying for other people's children? And I always give him the same answer, and he always asks the same question. And my answer is simply this: we never have this debate when it comes to a child who happens to be aged 5. Nobody seems to question that we should invest. You quoted James Heckman research in terms of human capital investment. Anybody that knows anything about early years will know the biggest return on human capital investment is when you invest early. And yet we wouldn't propose that we put secondary education, primary education, to be funded and supported into, if you like, the community. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying we wouldn't do that. And what the slight fear I have, as I say, is that it leads government to basically underfund. And what you see at the moment is you see that we are not included in the education sector. When, if I just carry on for just a second, if I may.
Oh, carry on.
When we went into lockdown and government said to the early years sector, we want you to step up, we want you to provide basically services for critical workers. A third of the settings opened up their doors, often with 2 or 3 attendees. And at that particular point in time, we didn't have a lot of scientific evidence. So the risk was unknown. They would go home in the evening and they would turn on the television and they'd see 1,000 people died. And so they reacted and they responded. At that point, all of a sudden, we were linked in with the education sector. On the 18th of June, and I'm sorry this is so pedantic, but it is important. On the 18th of June at 19:32 in the evening, I received a press release. This is why it's pedantic. I received a press release from the Department for Education, which basically said, it was all to do with the catch-up fund. And it had 2 messages within there. One from the Prime Minister that said, thank you to nursery workers and other educational establishments for all the work you've done. Great. One from the Secretary of State for Education, which basically said, this money is available for, and I quote, all children, regardless of their ages. Okay? So that was at 1932. At 2041, I received a revised press release, which said, ignore the first one. And the figure of £700 million for catch-up was reduced to £650 million. And what happened? The 2 messages remained, but early years was taken out of the pot. If that doesn't tell you that we are undervalued as a sector, and that government talks about the importance of education, but actually when it came to the hard cash, our sector was devalued and marginalized. And that's what I worry about. I think we have to ensure that anybody who has the ability to change the policy and the strategy understands how important this is.
Yeah. Claire, what do you think?
sorry, just come off mute. Yeah, it is a dilemma because the sector has been underfunded for a long time now. Okay, some of us social enterprises have made our nurseries work, and what we've done is to pay Pete, pay Pete to pay, to give the free places. We also, our nursery had to subsidise when we did the free hours, because government didn't give the amount of money that it cost, that the true cost of providing that free childcare. It didn't take in the elements that we needed. And so for some of us, we were not able to do as much as we could. Now, this to me is folly, because this to me is about an investment, and you will get a return on this investment, because if we have children that are cared for in that setting, their educational attainment, and don't forget, it's nurseries that usually identify some of the needs, the special needs that children have. So, for example, I have three of my boys who are autistic. Well, that was picked up in the nursery. They talked to me about it and got in this, the specialisms to support my boys through their nursery. And so it acts far more, it's further than what we think, and some people still have that thing, it's child minding. It's not child minding, it is child development. They are going above and beyond to support children with special needs, etc. And therefore we need to invest, we need to invest in our future. And I think I sit on Alder Hay to Children's Hospital in Liverpool. And again, I feel as a hospital trust, we're not around the tables where we should be, where we're looking at health and well-being. We're not involving children, children and young people in those discussions. So, I understand exactly what Neil is saying, is that sometimes we cut corners at our folly. We really do, because in the long term, you invest to make something absolutely work. So I'll leave it with you.
Thank you, Claire. Danny, it's interesting to hear your thoughts, and there are quite a lot of themes coming through from people's commentary that you might want to pick up on, particularly the notion that it can happen elsewhere, so it's not something that's not impossible for us. And also, again, interested in your thoughts from when you were in, when you were doing your own work. That point you made at the beginning about disconnecting, and how do you weave together that kind of lots of great services in one whole, so that actually there's a universality and a universal access that's more equitable for everybody through that kind of route.
Okay, thank you. Well, lots there. Let me try and get to that. I mean, I will get to that. I very much agree with what Neil was saying about, and Claire just now, about the sense that government, society, the media disregards this sector, and it often only sees schools as the relevant institutions, and that's a great shame. And yes, to the point that we don't need more consultations, the evidence is absolutely arguable, not to mention our own common sense and experience, that the early years matters, and that is now very well established as a sort of truth in Westminster and Whitehall, and yet we still haven't got the policy to reflect that acknowledgement. So what's going on, and how to change it is our challenge. Just to make clear what I was getting at with the value of the community-led sector, the community sector, I certainly don't think everything needs to be voluntary or even non-profit. I just think there is something around the particular role of thinking of the provision of childcare as a social enterprise, which mixes the entrepreneurialism of business with the mission of the public sector and the social sector. And the comparison with schools is interesting. Of course, schools are actually, in their foundation, there is quite a great degree of diversity on the supply side. You have church schools, you have foundation schools, you have free schools now, academies. So there's a great diversity of provision. Doesn't all work that well, but there's value in it. Crucially, though, it's all state funded, and that's where I think we do need to have a conversation about the appropriateness of a mixed economy in the early years. And my view is, for discussion here, because I don't claim to have the expertise of many of you, is that there is value in a mixed economy, and we will not achieve what June just asked for, which is a weaving together of the fragmented provision, if we effectively nationalise early years, which would what I imagine basically making it fully state funded would be. I think it's the same goes for the care sector. I'm terrified of us creating a national care service in the image of the NHS, a single top-down monopoly. I think there's great value in a bottom-up plural supply side in care, and I think we need to take the best of the system that we've got, which is a entrepreneurial mixed economy. We just need to get more money into it, and public money. I completely agree. We do need more public money, or we need to maybe allocate the money better and maybe make it more targeted. And so how to weave the system together? I think there is real value in allowing people to use their own money, use their own time. I'd allow people to take the money that's allocated for their child, their entitlement, and spend. They don't have to spend it on a highly formalized service, in my view. Why shouldn't they be able to spend their money, frankly, on themselves if they're doing the childcare, or on the grandparents, or on others? All needs to be properly regulated and managed, and there's huge. I can imagine the risks and dangers here, but I think we need to empower parents more effectively and have and just have a more community-led vision for what early years looks like.
I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you, because I obviously run a social enterprise, and I like the notion of social enterprises coming together. And I think that's a model that can be replicated in lots of ways. But fundamentally, we're doing what Claire is saying, and we're subsidizing one consistently. The advantage of being a social enterprise, of course, for us, is that there's an independence about it. So you don't have to always follow the sometimes very bad policy that actually isn't great for children or isn't great for staff, that you can avoid because you're independent. And also you've got a sort of influence in a way to reshape and rethink what we're trying to do. I guess the thing I was interested in your thoughts about is, if we were to use social enterprise as one model, to develop, to me, running LEYF, it won't work unless we have certain things as part of the parameters. So for example, you have to have a social pedagogy. You have to have something that's got a child right at the heart of it and actually is then delivered out. You have to have quality. Quality is about qualified staff. It's about great, strong pedagogy. It's about means of measuring that pedagogy to see how it's benefiting. You have to have what I call social capital, which you interestingly had that conversation about whether it's social capital or social cohesion, whether social capital leads to social cohesion, which is about connecting. Because one of the things I think that's interesting about the UK is context. Context is really interesting, because like what Claire would be doing in Liverpool would be different to London, and across our 39 nurseries, every community, even across the road, has got something different, and the way you negotiate and navigate those communities is quite interesting. So though there is lots of examples overseas, I'm always very wary of them, that you can't just pick up, Sweden. If I hear about Sweden one more time, I might cry, and just drop it on top of England, and that somehow or other it's going to work. That is not going to be the case. And I think that for us, we really have to create our own revolution that has a UK focus. But I mean, Neil, what's your thinking around some of this, in terms of not just the funding of the sector, because we need to think about the funding of the sector, but there has to be some kind of social contract that if you get more funding, that actually you deliver something, and that includes quality, and that includes a commitment to training your staff, not in some kind of two-penny training program, but in a serious way, in a serious degree, in a serious approach, but it has to come from us as a UK, or even England to start with, perspective as how do we value our children, how do we see our children, what's the purpose of the sector in a way. So we get kind of caught up in that sort of transactional and transformational. Are we going to transform the way we respond to children and the way we value children in our society? Are we simply going to be transactional? We give them a nursery place or a childminding place or whatever, they go to it, they get certain things done, EYFS or whatever, and then they come home again. You know, there's somehow or other that conversation is not being had. And I think social enterprise is often a good place for those kind of conversations. But I'm interested in your view.
It does, June, but then I think, you know, there are tens of thousands of providers that do exactly the same thing at this particular point in time. And I make no apology for constantly harping on about funding. Funding means investment, no matter what the model is.
Yeah.
And it comes back to equity. And so I guess at the end of the day, every single child has to have the opportunity. And the slight concern I have actually with attaching a pot of money to the child and it moves around with the child is that I'm not sure that that doesn't distort the market, because I can give you tens of examples, certainly when I was in the finance sector, where all sorts of loan schemes came out and then basically it distorted the market because you would have some operators who would use the system. And so at the end of the day, if we want to have every child have access and fair access, so we're not, you know, providing just a pot of money so the privileged could top it up and the rest of it, then government has to be honest. And I really welcome Danny's thoughts there. And you know, very brave, Danny, to say it needs investment, because you've actually said it. I'm sure lots of MPs believe the same thing, but they don't actually verbalize it. So for you to say it, fantastic. But why is it that is the battle we have year after year? So you will not get equity in terms of opportunity for children. You will not get highly trained staff. There is a reason every single year I'm hauled up in front of the Low Pay Commission for why our sector is one of the worst payers in the country. You wouldn't be doing that if you were in schools. It's because it comes back to this point. We see this as care. You said right at the beginning, June, that this was a, you know, you alluded to basically provision often is about getting parents back to work, and often women.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I was fortunate enough, I think it was fortunate enough, to sit in front of the Chancellor a few weeks ago. And I did think to myself during that conversation we were having, why am I making arguments about if you don't invest, you have the potential to destroy the infrastructure? So when the economy recovers, you'll have something in place to get people back into work. I was pretty appalled when I walked out, because I was making that argument. We should know it's about the education of children, and the cost of not getting it right is pretty horrendous. But what do? We don't invest in prevention. We put tens of thousands of pounds into cure after the event. So no matter what the model is, I make no apology, it needs investment. There is a reason, and I'll finish on this. There's a reason at this particular point in time that 1 year after we asked the Department for Education to provide us with the computations, because they've been arguing, we pay you, every press release that comes out says, you know, we've invested more than any other party before us, etc., etc. And so we said, okay, if you think that you pay enough money to providers, show us how you arrived at those computations. And we did that about 15 months ago. And what did they do? They said, go away, it's not in the public interest. So we went to the Information Commissioner's office and said, you need to rule on this. So what did they do? They ruled in our favor. We are still going through an appeal process, which is due to be heard in December. If you really believe that you invested enough, why would you do that? Wouldn't you just say, here are the figures, they're supported by every financial institution, but you don't, because you know you underfund it. Therefore, you turn a blind eye and hope things work out. So I'm pessimistic, but if you don't scream, you get nowhere.
Yeah. Claire, and also some reference to Social Value Act as well. The people are asking about that too.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to talk just about children's centres. It was fabulous when local authorities decided to build children's centres, and with them there was a lot of education for parents, and they worked really well. But as we know, when things get tough, what goes? And those children's centres went. And that was just an absolute tragedy for those communities where they were. Now, some have survived, but a lot of them will deal with nursery school children, but not younger children in that equation. So that has been, something that has been really regretful. And Neil's so quite right, is that the nursery sector is one of the worst paid sector, and they're dealing with the most precious cargo that we have, our children, and we pay them little. I mean, the rates are appalling. And I feel that, with nurseries, when children don't attain, or they don't have that nursery place, or they're in nurseries that don't have the excellence that they should have because there is lack of investment in training and support, etc. What happens? We pass that problem on to the schools. And then we start to see the league tables, and we start to see the schools in the poorest areas and the kids that are going from nursery to school and still have got, clear issues because they haven't had that level of support to get them to that school readiness. And one of the things in my nursery was that, that last year in nursery, when we did that extra work with the children to get them ready, to get them ahead of the game for when they went into school. So social value, well, June and I have been in this patch for many years. Running social enterprises has been key. And many of you know now that my work in government as the Crown Rep has been about driving social value through procurement in government. But social value is much more than that, and the framework that we've got it's based around the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's important also. So we have to see, and Danny, Danny and I talked about this when Danny was doing his paper, and I was trying to get the social value framework out of number 10, which it came out 4 weeks ago now. And we are working full belt because the 1st of January is D-Day for us, and I can't tell you how pleased I am about that. But we should be able to use this against the lives of children and the social impact that not having that support and that opportunity at an early age, because that not only impacts that family, it impacts that child, the schools, and that community where that child lives. So we've got to be able to do more. And June and I looked ages ago, remember June, when we talked about having a national social enterprise children's in nursery group, to try and put some, as we say, put some welly into this, because Neil can go in, but he needs us also to be there, alongside him for the successes that we have. And one of the things we were able to do in my nursery is that, we did make a profit, but our profits went back into the nursery or into the education of the women. It wasn't something that, shareholders were getting hold of. But we had to work really smart, and we worked with other nurseries to provide decent training for our nursery nurses. So we shared the cost out as opposed to it being just, in my organization. And so there were innovative ways that we worked. But we've got to get behind. There's got to be something that changes, because you can't have this system of unevenness, unequalness for some children and not others. There's got to be a way forward.
Danny, I know you've got to go soon, so I'm going to give you the last word on some of this stuff. But Neil and Claire can stay, thank God. Because everyone's contribute £10 to this towards our hardship fund for our children, actually. So we got to give them value for money.
Okay, well, yes. And you guys have been very restrained, seeing as I'm representing the nasty Tory government that isn't giving enough money. I appreciate not being attacked personally. I mean, let me give you a political perspective, which is really, I think we haven't as a country decided what early years provision is for. Let's just leave aside provision for school-age children, which is a massive issue, but just preschool. I think we're still operating in the model that it's basically subsidised. We're subsidising working parents. We're providing them with somewhere for their children while they go to work. And then we can discuss the quality of that work. But basically, that's I think the political frame that we've had, certainly since I've been sort of active in politics over the last 10 years or so, is very much focused on that. And I regret that, because I don't think that's how we should see it. But we must decide as a country, is that why the public is interested in supporting parents of early years kids, of preschool kids, or is it because we think that the provision that the public sector can pay for, that the public purse can pay for, will actually help children grow up well? And if it's that, then we are we need a national debate about that model, and what good parenting and how children are properly best brought up by a village, how that works and what that looks like. And are we imagining that everyone should be in the same system together? Are we then saying that there should be some sort of incentive or expectation that the children of families that don't require subsidy or don't choose to take it up should in fact be part of this same system? So I totally understand all of Neil's frustration, given the reality that he's working in. But it's because we haven't yet got to a national consensus around what this work is for. I'm getting told off in the chat for calling it preschool. So there you go. We don't even have the right language or consensus around language yet. And we are slightly in sort of 1870 territory, which is when they first started creating state funding for elementary schools. I think we haven't got the public political consensus yet, and I guess that's our challenge. So we know that early years really, really matters, but we haven't yet worked out what the social contract around that is, and that's our challenge. So I'm not answering a question, I'm just reposing the question we're all discussing, I guess.
No, but at least you're reflecting on that from a different perspective, which I think is helpful for us. And again, you're not coming at it from the, knowing everything about early years and this, that's bread and butter stuff. So it's, one can't expect that, you're going to know the ins and outs of the granularity of the issues. But I think it's interesting for you to reflect on this, like it's elementary school. In fact,
that point that Helen's just made is very interesting in the chat. Sorry to interrupt you.
Helen makes many interesting comments. She works with us. She's from the University of Wolverhampton, and she and I run the first LEYF degree. So always talk sensibly. I'm just looking at what Helen wants. She wants the Children's Commissioner to step up.
No, above that, we had a consensus. We had an era when the funding was for early education. It's morphed into childcare funding with a 30-hour policy.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Neil, what do you think around that? I mean, what on Helen's point alone? Given what I was going to say was the link to the history of elementary school is very interesting. About the when you reflect back, and Margaret Horn was a part of that journey, which is why this whole thing is called after her. And the challenges. And I was rereading a book recently I've written in about the women of that time, and they had similar challenges. And if you look at something like some of the great old-fashioned educationalists like Thring, the politics and the education politics, there were always challenges. There were always challenges. So we're not actually seeing anything that's very different to how it was, but then they came through with something. So in the end, I guess the question we have to ask too is, if we're going for a national early years education service with meeting both those policies, like they are in some of the European countries and certainly overseas as they are emerging in other parts of the world, then how do we align that within the funding structure, and how do we align that in terms of the public's willingness to accept that it is part of the way we do things around here, rather than necessarily doing a favor because they are giving something back from their taxes, which I think is the Nick Ferrari kind of view that you have. Yeah. You're on mute, Neil.
I was about to say that's a fairly loaded question. I mean, just before that, I would like to sort of thank Danny for his point about and almost accepting that it isn't part of government's agenda. Just to reiterate, it was interesting. I was sitting in front of the Chancellor and not the Secretary of State for Education. And I'd also, I think there were moments when the Chancellor was saying to me, how is it that I'm not getting enough leverage from the Department for Education to make the points that you're making, which was not an impressive place to be. So thank you for that, Danny. I think your question, June, is, I'm a big fan of Peter Moss, actually, and I think Peter Moss gets it right when he says that what we tend to do is that we have an approach whereby, and I think this is about educating parents as much as anything else, but we do tend to have an approach where we feel like we have to take a child who's empty and is hollow, then fill them up with all of this stuff, rather than let a child explore and develop. And it goes as far back to almost, you know, human rights and the rights of a child to be able to discover for themselves and to have a voice. So I think that's probably where you would start. I think you would, and I think we have a danger at this particular point in time that there's more and more pressure to do things as an exact science, if that makes sense, and follow a specific path rather than let individuals be individuals. I remember sitting in front of a minister when we were right in the middle of the ratio debate, and that minister said to me, Neil, what's wrong with 22-year-olds sitting at a desk learning from rote? And that was a minister that was in the education department. And so I think maybe that's why we still, coming back to Danny's point as well, that's why we haven't moved on from this position that early years is seen as care. And I know Peter says that we should possibly drop the word care and just use education. But of course, we're frightened of that because education is synonymous with formal education. And that's why people are nervous about using that word in isolation. But it's inherent in the word education. Care is inherent within it. You would not educate a child unless you cared for them. Just as I think the statement about, you know, Black Lives Matter, it's inherent when people say all lives matter, it's inherent in the statement Black Lives Matter that all lives matter. And similarly, I think it's the same in education, that's about care naturally anyway. So I'd go back to basics, but it would be about the child.
Danny, do you need to go?
I do, I'm afraid, but I mean, let me just, I mean, again, to be, I hope, helpful and try and sort of speak from Tory land, which I think, you know, we did have a majority of public support, and I think we speak for a lot of the public on this, is, you know, what I'm hearing, Neil, and in the chat is that most people in this conversation really believe there's a place for professionals in the early years.
Yeah.
And that isn't where the public is, a lot of them. They think that it's for families to be bringing up children, and then they go to school at 4 or 5. Now, except when they need a bit of help, you know, with childcare. Now, I'm massively caricaturing and simplifying, but that is the paradigm that we're operating in. And I don't think it's a bad paradigm, because we do need to have parental responsibility. And we need to really think about the parent-child relationship and so on. But that's where we're starting from. And if we just, I just predict disaster if we try and make the argument that education needs to begin earlier, that we need to, you know, in somehow insist or ensure that there is, you know, greater or more time spent by children in professional settings. I mean, personally, I think we do need that. I don't like this arbitrary moment at which children suddenly leave the home and go into an institution, i.e. school. I think we need to mix it up. And we know that that's what works. So I'm very much in favour of the work that you guys do and the model that we're reaching for. I'm just thinking about the framing of it. To me, we haven't yet cracked it in a way that's going to basically work for the essentially conservative voters that we have and politicians that are running the country at the moment. I hope that's helpful.
Could I just say, Danny, that's the rhetoric. The words in terms of education come out from the Department of Education for Education. And so either they don't believe it, or it is, you know, hollow. They don't do anything about it. They accept, if you talk to ministers, and I've heard the Secretary of State say about the importance of education, that it isn't just about care. So they agree. And I do take your point that not every parent, but I accept that, you know, you weren't implying it was every parent, but increasingly, I do think more and more parents see the value of education within early year settings, whether it be with a childminder or a group setting, whatever it happens to be. But it's partly our job, obviously, to educate them in that way. But I do think the messages that come from government, you know, can either be really positive or they can sit on the fence. So when it comes to early years, they sit on the fence. Talk about the importance of getting kids back into secondary school. That's all we've heard for the last couple of months.
Yeah, quite.
Early years, it was only so parents could get back to work. They didn't use that excuse when it came to secondary school children. No,
well put. Very good point. There you go. So that is our problem, which is that it is all framed in this sort of basically helping out working parents.
And I think this has not just been, you know, you said Conservative Party. This has been every government for a long time. This is, you know, that we've had this problem. And, you know, when we look, you know, the professionalism that, you know, we talked about in early years, which is important. And there is a contract with parents because you both are working together for the good of their child. They don't just come in and dump their children. There's so much more that goes into that. And one of the things I've been saying in government around social value and how we look at public sector procurement is that we need to co-create services. Government thinks that they know what's right. And that's why, you know, at the moment, you know, we've had our contracts come back in-house from rehabilitation because they haven't worked, because somebody in the department thinks they know what is needed and you don't. And the way you get to a great service is to work with people as equal partners to look at what the need is and crafting that together. And so there's got to be that narrative. And some parents, you know, even when I was working in the 80s on this, they had no choice but to look at childcare and to put their children in nurseries because they had to, because they needed, you know, they needed that finance into their households. So it was an imperative for them, but they wanted something that was great for their child and that would, you know, give those child the opportunities that they should have. So I think it's, you know, it's not Conservative or Labour, it's every successive government. And I think also, you know, we talk about ministers sometimes, but as we know, Danny, senior civil servants give them their lines. And so there has to be responsibility in departments and in the Department of Education for what they think and what they tell. The good story is, okay, I think a good minister will you know, challenge them on some things, but really they have to hear from what the civil servants are. That's why we needed more politicians to come up north. But now with Zoom, we've got everyone.
Let me just finish with another final provocation, and I must go, June. That's very well put, Claire. And it's good to hear you speak up for the transforming rehabilitation as well, because not many people recognise the value of the original idea there, which was to enable more local social sector provision. Yes, and the DFE, I mean, you know, this is where Dominic Cummings learned his business, was basically beating up DFE's civil servants to make them let go of school provision and set up the free school movement. And
I remember him, Danny.
And you know, the achievement, the tragedy, I think, of the Michael Gove era, DFE, the Cummings-Gove period, was they're guilty of what we've just been discussing, which is the preference for schools over everything else. You know, it was the Department for Families or something, wasn't it, under Labour? Yeah. And then Michael said, you know, and I respect this decision, but it was, which was to say, schools are in a mess. We need to fix the school system, and we've just got to focus on that and get the pedagogy right and reform the supply side and do all that. And you can argue whether it was good or bad, but that was the mission. But it did involve giving power away and of supply side. Obviously, they insisted on controlling the curriculum. But they haven't done something similar in early years, and not that you guys necessarily want Gove and Cummings running this bit of the sector, but something of that spirit. Yes, Helen, that's right. That's my point. Left out children and families bit. Okay.
As it happens, this is our 9th minister. That's one of the problems. We have a lot of ministers going through, and
yes.
and Claire is right. It's non-party political. It's beyond all of that. Yeah. But I say on your as you disappear out. Your interest in this is growing and is deep, and I'm really appreciative of it. And so I think if we can get somebody like you to have those levels of conversation to inform both the civil servants and the ministers, I think we have a movement. That partly the problem we have too is that politicians don't understand the early years any more than the public does, and so they fixate only on the 5+, not realizing, of course, the influence first. So I think that's a really interesting thing from the inside of the inside of Toryland, as opposed to us on the outside of La La Land. So yeah.
Well put. Okay, very good to see you all, and sorry to be leaving a bit early, but been absolutely fascinating, and we'll keep talking. Bye, guys. See you later.
Bye now. So Team Neil, Team Claire, we have 50 million thousand questions still going on, and I have no idea what the time is, but I'm sure it's, somebody tell me. No, it can't be. He's going to be in such trouble if it's 8:05. I promised he'd be out on time. Even though Claire, there's Grace, she's telling me, look at all these people who are on degrees with the University of Wolverhampton, all the Bobby Joes of this world, they're obviously learning a great deal. So I hope there's an assignment in there from this debate for you lot. So you won't have wasted your time for an hour and a half in the evening. Claire, talk a bit more about the social enterprise model. I mean, I'd be interested in our audience's view, because for years we've been trying to think about a network of just social enterprise nurseries and people interested in that way of doing things. Not to take away from the work that Neil does or anything like that, but to add some value to it because of the emphasis on social capital and the emphasis on co-creation and connections and stuff. And in a way, the UK leads on social enterprise. That's the interesting thing. We actually lead on social enterprise. People invite us all over the place to talk about things because we're kind of ahead of the game. And there is some strength in that, but I wouldn't want to then devalue I wouldn't want it to be used like a competitive thing where it's, social enterprise good, everything else bad, and that sort of Orwellian kind of idea. So I just, the work you're doing on transformation is really interesting, Claire, and I think people don't always recognize the stuff going behind the scenes. So quite interesting that, because I think, Neil, you and I haven't talked enough about this. We talk a lot about funding and about the inadequacy of people's understanding of early years and the status that we face and the infighting that goes on, which people out there will say, no, it doesn't, but really, really it does. And the fact that we can't all call ourselves teachers does my head in, as you know, and that we're referred to as practitioners and educators and all sorts of a range of things, when actually we're all early years teachers. And to own that language to start with is just incredibly useful, because it starts you out, because that's the interesting thing. We're all clapping, all there out clapping for the key workers, but the key workers were defined as teachers. The fact that, like you said, Neil, we were all open, people were open and willing on a 10% occupancy rate. It took a long time before they started to even recognize us. So I'm very interested, and I think the audience very interested in the kind of behind the scenes stuff that goes on that we just do because that's the way you are, as well as the front-facing kind of conversation.
Do you want me to go first on that? So my work has been around social value and the procurement, getting social value into procurement and government. And so when I came into government to start to look at opening contracts to the voluntary social enterprise sector, something happened that sent ripple waves through government, and that Carillion collapsed. So for procurement, this was dire, and so they were desperate to find some way of looking at how we procure in the future. And June and I have been involved for many years with Social Enterprises, Social Enterprise UK. I was the chair for over 10 years, and we were responsible for getting that Social Value Act through Parliament. And so for me, it was to work on that, and we've got the framework, and it's been signed off by the PM. 10% of all our contracts now will be on social value. But as I said, I just talked about the MOJ, their rehabilitation, and they've gone in straight at 25%, which is fantastic because it works to the strength of the social enterprise movement and what we've been doing in charities. But what has worried me is how they put together contracts. And, you know, I was saying, you know, as I was saying before, is that ministers are fed things by civil servants. And sometimes you have to get to them because they're the ones that will influence what is going on and what will happen. And what I've said to departments, I can't understand, you know, they come and they say, oh, this service hasn't worked. Why isn't it working? And now at the moment, they want social value to be attached to it, and they want the VCSEs to be part of the solution. But what I've said to them is that there's no sense in just giving us those contracts of things you want the sector to do, because sometimes they're not the right, you know, it's not the right a system or you know, what is needed. And so more and more what I'm saying to them, let's start working on co-creating of services together. And so MOJ are going to do that. We've got a sum of money. We're going to start co-creating. We've just put, you know, with BAME organisations, we've just got £1 million for them to sit and look at some of the service that are needed. Now, some of this is build new frontiers, and I've only got so far. However, when we're measuring all of this, as we will be measuring the social impact, and to see what has worked on the one hand and what didn't work for a long time, you know, we can demonstrate that this will work. You know, I know years ago I worked, I did some work in housing, and we looked at some of the housing estates in Liverpool, and they throw up these houses, and before you know, they were in need of repair and whatever. They just didn't work because somebody decided what those houses should look like and what they should be. And when they started working with communities to build community housing, and the pride that people had that they'd been part of it. And it's like, if some of you have heard of Housing for Humanity, where you put sweat equity into the house, and in the end, the sweat equity you earn, you know, you're buying your house, is that they're the ones that have really worked, because people feel part of that. They feel a sense of, you know, of pride in what they've been able to achieve. And so I think, again, you know, many of us have worked with our parents, have spoken to our parents, we've listened to them and what we can do to make this better. And I think that's the problem with government, is they don't always listen, they react. And that is some of the problems that we have.
I agree. And Neil?
Just to pick up on a couple of other points, because I think both of you are better at articulating that particular question. But in terms of teachers, if I could just come back to that, the reason that, of course, we don't call them teachers is because teachers have status, and status has value, and value means a pot of money. And I suggest that's why, basically speaking, there is a reluctance on behalf of government to recognise that we teach. So that's an ongoing problem. I think the whole social enterprise, and I really like Dawn's comment there, which was all about balance, because this is about balance, and it's run through actually the conversation. So there's no perfect model at this particular point in time, but we do have a bit of a crisis on our hands. Back in, I think it was March, we did a survey of 3,000 providers, so it wasn't insignificant. That's a fair proportion, because a large proportion of those providers were group providers. And one in four was telling us that without basically sustainability funding, some intervention, that in 12 months' time, they were unsure that they would go, whether they would still be here. They might go by the wayside. What was even more worrying is that Sutton Trust took those statistics that we'd basically accumulated, that research, and they looked at the areas basically where those providers would go from. And you won't be surprised that that figure moved to 1 in 3 in areas of deprivation. So there is no question there is a need there, but there is also a need from, I guess, the private sector as well, to actually be able to operate in those areas. And so I'm not sure, and this sounds a little bit defeatist, but I'm not sure in the next 12 months, when we are potentially seeing thousands of providers go by the wayside, that we can afford to wait for more holistic approach. I think it needs intervention at this particular time. We've lost in 2017 through to 2020, we've lost something like 20,000 providers in the early years sector on a core base of 53,000. That is a massive churn. And this is not me making up these figures. These come from Ofsted. Now, Ofsted will talk about places and others will talk about the number of places is roughly the same. But any sector where you see 20,000 providers come out of a base of 53 tells you you've got a fundamental problem. And so I guess I still come back to this particular point that we have to address the now. And it would be folly to think that the PVI sector did not play an important part of delivery. And the only way you'll stabilize that is if basically we adequately fund it. There is a reason, and this is slightly controversial, but there is a reason that government have not bothered to monitor whether the free entitlement is delivered on the basis that it was originally intended without basically any caveats attached, etc. It's because they know providers can't do it. If they paid the right money, they could then, for want of a better word, police that children get access without basically restrictions. But they can't afford to do it because they know operators would go by the wayside. I rest my case.
Yeah, I don't want you to rest your case, though. We want a revolution, Neil. And so the question has to be, all of that is true. And the sector is itself sometimes its worst enemy because it's come together. Yeah, it doesn't come together. No,
it's divisive. And you know, I will stick my neck out here. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, I spoke to a major provider just a few days ago, and a big provider in the UK. And I asked them a question: what would you do? Set aside personal interests, set aside your shareholding, set aside your concerns that if your investors ever find out that you've made these comments, what would you do? And they said, we would have community over commodities. Effectively, we wouldn't operate this model. But they're never going to say it. They're never going to say it. And it's divisive. In the ratio debate, there were providers who knew that it was not in the best interest of children to have, you know, sort of more and more children piled onto a teacher to look after. And yet, economically, from their shareholders' perspective, from their investors' perspective, they did not come out and basically criticize that policy. I get it. I understand it as a conflict of interest, but it doesn't help us. And the fear is that if you had something that was slightly more militant, so if you had, and my predecessors go back, I mean, the Alliance celebrates its 60th year next year. And it came from people who had a fervor, had basically the desire to do the right thing. And they marched on Parliament. I've seen the photographs, etc., etc., etc. But the fear we have at the moment, apart from the fact we're in lockdown, but if you ask people to do that, you'd look behind you and you wouldn't have enough. And you wouldn't have enough big players in the market. And that's divisive.
It's also neoliberal. And it's really the big consequence of neoliberalism, isn't it? Even though, actually, ironically enough, we are mostly made up of small groups of 3 and 4, but the dominance of the kind of the big chains that are driven by venture capitalists and the churn that comes from people coming into the sector, buying up, you know, squeezing blood out of it, turning it around, and talking about churn. That's problematic for us, isn't it?
But to be fair, Jude, I have to say that I know of organisations that where they have, you know, they have those sort of investments, they have international investments, they have venture capitalists basically, and the leaders are as committed to doing the right thing for children as I suggest everybody on this chat this evening is. Otherwise, you wouldn't be spending your evening here, would you? Unless you were fundamentally moved to do the right thing. And there are enough big providers with venture capitalists behind them that feel that. But of course, feeling it and being able to verbalize it are two different things.
No, and so yeah, and then the balance and the equity becomes at risk because they can't operate in the way that the likes of Claire and I can operate, where you choose to go into an area of deprivation, you choose to make sure a proportion of your places are reinvested. So that, for example, the LEYF last year, we did 33%. That was 1,600 children were guaranteed. Well, we know that loads of nurseries are taking, if we're lucky, 1 or 2 or none at all, or they're having to really consider whether they even, you know, provide things like lunch and support services and the like. So I think that is a challenge. But if you think that if that's only 12 to 15% of the sector, that means the rest of us are much of a muchness. So there is something about us having, I think, shared language. And I think shared language is really important. And words are really important in terms of determining a narrative that we all can get behind. And I think it's probably time that we reflect that. You know, we oscillate with the language we use. We use childcare, we use education, we use early childhood, we use early years, we use all those kind of words. So academics will talk about ECEC. You know, in the sector ourselves, you and I, if we're in with the DFE, we tend to talk about childcare, and parents see it in terms of childcare. What can we offer? Some other places will talk about nursery. Some people will then define childmind as, you know, we talk about settings, we talk about preschool. We don't actually have a narrative that we all sign up to that has got credibility. Therefore, when we go to the public, they're as confused as we are about things, you know. So there's a kind of snobbery around some of the language we use as well. You talk about early years, it's kind of got a higher percent, you know, protective factor about it, and maybe more popular, you know, in an academic space. And we talk about childcare because that's what a parent will ask when they come to the door, and that's seen as probably less and more transactional, not transformational. There's all of those things. I'm not saying anything is right or not saying anything is wrong. You know, it's a bit like the BBC fixating on Ofsted's report the other day on knives and forks. You know, how stupid just to pick up on that, when actually that if you looked at the smaller print, it was about children's language, children's physical skills, children's personal, social and emotional, and all of those things. But they fixate on something kind of clever and witty, and it wasn't, because it missed the point.
I mean, you know, I shared your thoughts on that report. When you read the report, if you listen to, you know, I mean, Radio 5 or Radio 4, whatever it happens to be, or even the interviews, you would think it was a complete disaster. When you read that report, the biggest part of the report talked about what early years practitioners were doing in the interim to engage with parents who weren't coming into the setting. But we have to accept that, you know, that is not newsworthy. That doesn't make, you know, somebody basically focus and listen. So the job of us is to take that and switch it back and say, well, maybe, but what about the other half of the report that said X, Y, Z, so and so? And you know, I guess, dare I say, maybe I feel a bit worn down this evening, and maybe it's because that's how I feel, that it is a constant battle. Is it Maya Angelou said something like, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Yeah. And I think to a degree, that's how the sector is at this point, completely devalued by what's going on. And so, you know, our job is to lift them. I mean, you know, the conversation's been really good, but it has been a bit depressing.
Well, yes,
but I'm not one for giving up.
Yeah, yes and no. And do you think we should have a Royal College then of early years with a bit like the I don't know, the medicals profession and stuff, where because you have a body of knowledge, you know, there's a body of knowledge to be an early years teacher, you need a body of knowledge and stuff, and that actually we come and cohere around that idea, which has got some kind of neutrality. I mean, I don't know, Claire, what do you think about that as an idea? Do you think that's like a bit, you know, old-fashioned?
Because in the chat before, I talked about the commissioner and, you know, whether that works, you know, for the sector. And if it doesn't, then we shouldn't have it. We should have something that is appropriate, that works on behalf of the sector. And I think, you know, it can be depressing sometimes, Neil. I agree with you. But, you know, we then have to pick ourselves up, because it's, you know, who we are centering on at the moment is that child that needs what we are doing so desperately. But I know when I first went into the start of social enterprise many years ago, and we were all individuals around the country. We had no formation, no body. And then I got together with Liam Black and some other people, and you know, and then we were with Patricia Hewitt. We sat on the old good Trade and Industry, Department for Trade and Industry. So that's going back a good few years. And we did the first ever strategy for social enterprise. And but then we knew we needed a collective, and that's where the Social Enterprise Coalition came into being. And we were able then to, you know, group around that, because we needed it. We needed those discussions, because, you know, I've had discussions with you now and again when I was running our nursery, and I know the great work that, you know, obviously you do, Neil, but we need you and you need us. And so we've got to sort of say, you know, what is it? What, you know, should we have this, you know, a college of early years or Royal College? I've always been a bit upset, and so don't shoot me down, any animal lovers on the line tonight, when we have the Royal Society Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but we only have the NSPCC for kids. That said it all about this country years ago, you know, that it wasn't, it didn't, you know, and even more so now, you know, I saw a dog being walked in a pram the other day. Jesus Christ, I had no 4 legs. Anyway, sorry, I digress. But that, you know, that says something about what we have thought about the child in the past, and where we are now. And so I think, you know, yeah, there's got to be a new narrative, and maybe you coalesce around something else, you know, that beefs it up a bit. But we need something. We, you know, it can't go around in these, you know, these circles that we've been talking about, you know, for years, and you know, feeling disempowered in a way, and especially when, you know, I used to look at some of my staff, which, Jesus, I take my hat off to them for what they did each and every day to support our children and our students' children and community children. They did an amazing job. So that's where I'm at on it, June.
Well, I'm wondering, because we have a Duchess who's quite interested in early years, and actually has shown quite an interest in the challenges around that. So it might be that the time has come when it might be a way to go, really. And I think it would be, and there's a sort of neutrality about it that brings everyone round, because at the moment, you know, at the moment we have organizations that are membership organizations like Neil, that really advocate in terms of the politics and the funding. But a Royal College really, for me, would be around the pedagogy of what is great for a child. You know, what is the best, what does quality look like, and how do we hold it to account, and pulls all the range of research into one space, where at the moment we have it everywhere. And there's fantastic research out there, and it continues to be developed. But it's that sort of thing. I don't know, Neil, what do you think? Because we're running out of time soon now.
I agree entirely, and I would suggest that would just drive everything. I mean, I was mindful when Claire was talking in terms of what moves things along, and I think predominantly there are 2 things that bring about change. One is royal intervention. 3 things probably. 3 is a personality. So Marcus Rashford is a very good example of a complete U-turn of policy, despite the fact that, you know, just about every minister every minister in the Department for Education voted against continuing with school meals. So that said it all for me. So I think it's either a royal attachment, a celebrity, or parents. And I think of the ratio debate, the time when that changed, the point when that changed was when parents said, hang on a minute, not in our name. So when you get parents, you get votes, and then you have a concern. But anything that moves it into a different direction, that gives it a different status, I don't think it has to be driven by, we have to get that status first, then we are allowed to form a college. I think whatever you can get, you take. at this particular point in time. And I do think one of the positives in all of this is that if I measure the media attention in terms of whether it was positive or negative in the last 3 years compared to where it was 10 years ago, I'll tell you it's 500% better.
Yeah.
The media are starting to get the fact that we do a bloody good job. Yeah. We are used. We are basically deprived of the rewards that we should get. And when you get the media on board, you've got to use it. So I think we're, in some ways, we're in a better place. I can't believe that, well, no, I won't say it. Forget it.
Now you have to say it now. Now we're all hanging on your every word, Neil.
Come on, Neil.
Come on.
I was going to say that I can't believe that we can't get an interview with the Secretary of State, but we can get it with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's a good sign. I think that is a good sign. For one reason or another, I probably won't tell you why I think that's the case, but the reality is, I don't think we would have got that 5 years ago. So hang on to the desperation. It's really frustrating, but the reality is, I think more and more people are starting to come over in terms of the public to value what we do. And I like Danny's comment, I have to say. I thought Danny was brave. He's a Tory MP. I criticised government, but he had the wherewithal to say, you're right. We've got the focus of attention on getting people into work, not on what's in the best interest of the child.
No, that's true. That's true. And then I think we have to also, as a sector, we have to reject some of the policy decisions that we also sidle up to. So, because the DFE funds quite a lot of organizations, then people believe that they have to do what they have to do. And so they sign up for it. And like the schoolification argument, the phonics argument, all of those totally inappropriate for our very smallest children. The fact that babies never get mentioned, which is, I think, a very big anxiety for the word education. I think in the sector, they're terrified of accepting the word education because it would exclude babies, but actually babies are quite a big part of our services and stuff. So I think there's something around that. So to conclude then, we want a new narrative. We want a Royal College, and we want courage and confidence, says Dawn. And Laura always wants action, but Laura, make another TV program on it and we have a chance, love. Yeah. So I think we're going to conclude now. So Claire, do you want a final word on anything? And Neil, prepare yourself because I'm going to ask you the same.
No, I'm just right behind Neil on all of this now because he's got a long to-do list.
Well, the thing is, Neil and I are getting old, and we can't leave and retire to water our plants in the garden without fighting to the end and having completed some of our tasks. And our tasks really are having raised the issue of early years and doing something different, like setting up a social enterprise or whatever and building it up. We have to have a way out that doesn't make Neil upset. Come on, guys. We have to make sure that when we retire, and the LEYF staff in the audience, I am not retiring yet, don't worry. But we need to know that on our epitaph, we won't have, they nearly did it. We have to have on our epitaph, they bloody well did it. And look what we've got now. We've got an early years sort of sector that actually values the child, values the role of the child in the sector, values the role of the early years teacher. And I never hear the word practitioner ever again. So that would be my ending to this. Do you want to have a final word, Neil, before we pull the plug on all of this?
I started work in 1968, and I think I worked hard throughout my whole life. You were two. In 15 years. 18 years ago, I thought we had a management buyout of the bank, and I thought I had semi-retired. I work harder now than I've ever worked in my life.
Oh, I know.
But I have never in my life felt the cause was so important, and the people
Yeah.
I work with and I share my thoughts and my challenges and passions with just make it all worthwhile. And that's absolutely genuine. That's what I think. But I still would like to retire.
I mean, I did retire this year, Neil, in August from my organisation in Liverpool after 40 years. And but I'm working in government because there's so much unfinished work to do. And I think that, you know, debates like tonight absolutely energize me because there's still much to do. And just, you know, just on this issue alone, you know, we need to come together. We need more discussions like this. It has to be mainstream on the agenda, and we have to support, you know, the Alliance and, you know, other nurseries around this country because, you know, I'm working with women-led organisations in government at the moment, and even where they were concerned, you know, some of the things in government that were not working right. So we need this, and I don't know, maybe, you know, we'll retire at some point. I can't see it in the immediate future though.
On that happy note, none of us are retiring in the immediate future, but we all want another plan to keep going, because you're right, we've never worked so hard in our lives. So thank you to everyone who came. Thank you for all these fantastic comments. Actually, later on, Neil, when you're having a glass of something, read the comments. Yeah, when you're having your Alka-Seltzer for your for your indigestion, and Claire is on one of her fancy cocktails, read the chat. It'll make you feel a lot better, actually. And for the young people out there, you know, like Bobby Joe and all of those younger people coming up who are going to take our jobs at some point, thank God, then you know, let's set the scene for them. Okay, well, so thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. We will try and do a New Year one like this, I think, because you're probably right. We probably do need to have more of these. And the one benefit of Zoom is this is much easier to organize than in the flesh. Although I'm looking forward to meeting people in the flesh, 2 meters apart without a mask.
June, thanks for the invitation. I've really enjoyed this evening. Thank you so much.
So much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone. Thank you to all the people on the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Good to
Great
meet
to do
you.
something, so we're all disappearing.
Okay. Thanks, Neil. Good to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. Thank you.
Thanks, Gracie. Thanks, Neil.
Take care, June.
I'll be in contact.
Yeah. Look forward to Joanna's.
Yeah, it's still going.
One day.
One day at a time.